enough of this, like, how does your favorite sport impact your hot executive functioning? Like, that's not what we need to be looking at right now.
If everyone could get on the same page about how they were describing it and how they were discussing it, we could make some real movement.
We might just spin our wheels trying to like write this email, and now we're crying because we can't like write the email, and now we can't write the email because we're crying and we can't even see the computer. Gosh. So,
This is not triggering at all. Hello, everyone. Today we have a very interesting paper coming to you. I say paper rather than podcast because we're going to be talking about one paper hot off the press talking about executive functioning. So we've been deep diving executive functioning, really trying to get to the bottom of this. And to be honest, so have the experts. They've also been trying to get to the bottom of this. So we've been just kind of along for the ride. What do you think, Sarah?
This is really cool. I can't wait to teach somebody, hopefully, something brand new about executive functioning that they may never have heard of before. This is really going to be one of those like fusion theories. So yeah, super excited to talk about this.
Definitely. So let's just jump into the article. So basically, this is an interesting one. It's a critical, with emphasis on the word critical, review of hot executive functioning in youth with ADHD. So they looked at methodological limitations, conceptual considerations, and future directions. And this one came out from the Cambridge University Press in 2024. So very, very new, and really it came in hard. It came in with a vision, a mission statement to really understand what is happening in executive functioning, and particularly in this concept of hot and cold executive functioning, which we're going to get into in a minute. So yeah, Sarah, do you want to take us through kind of like a little bit of what they were doing?
Yes, absolutely. Basically, the concept of hot and cold executive functioning refers to the presence or not of emotional stimuli while doing executive functioning tasks. So the presence of emotion means hot executive functioning, just basic standard logic, no emotion. That's cold executive functioning. Not sure why, but that is how it is. I think it's because the hot neural circuits with the emotions. I don't know. It feels right.
Yes, yeah. It feels right. I like to imagine it as like a little cartoon character with steam lines coming off them. Like that's the hot executive functioning.
Yeah, that is what my brain feels like sometimes.
Yeah.
For sure. And yeah, I'm going to go back to this critical review thing because it's not a systematic review. They actually specifically say that it would have been impossible for them to do it this way because the terms are not being used appropriately. I don't know. It seems like there's not a consensus on what these terms mean, how we should be measuring them. There's a lot of inconsistency in the literature as well. So this review ran into a lot of issues with the research. But they did a really good job.
They did a really good job. They really did their absolute best, and they went into it, and we really appreciate that. And also, honestly, I super appreciate the transparency talking about how difficult this was, because sometimes that can kind of get, academic away in the way it's written, and bringing it out to the forefront for those of us who are struggling with ADHD. It was really nice to be able to see that this was something that they, wanted to talk about. So, okay, can you give us some examples, Sarah, if we're thinking about, hot executive functioning? Maybe it would be helpful if we could think of a moment, like what are some moments like maybe in our lives or in clients' lives where hot executive functioning would be happening?
Sure. So, I mean, we could even talk about it, how they did it in this study, because they had to separate it into two different ways, because some studies would just measure a regular executive functioning task and then add some emotion to it, sort of like make you repeat some numbers, but then also they're standing over you and like shouting in your ear.
Yeah, that's horrible, by the way.
But then there's also this other thing they call decision-making tasks, where they're measuring like your impulsivity and your gambling behaviors.
That's interesting. Okay, so if we're thinking about real life examples, I mean, I guess the first thing that comes to me when I think about you're trying to do something and someone's shouting in your ear would be driving. If you've ever learned to drive or you've had a backseat driver and you're trying to make decisions and, you find yourself in a position where somebody's kind of going like, go left, like stop, do this, go right. I can imagine that would be a time where your hot executive functioning would be very much in use.
Yes, absolutely. I think actually that's related to the response. Yeah, maybe it's the inhibitory control type of tasks that
Mm,
they talk about
mm,
here when you're
yeah.
trying to suppress certain responses, but then make sure that
Mhm.
you are still doing some responses like the ones
Yes.
you need. That
Yes.
totally sounds right.
Yeah. Ooh, what about the one when, like, your boss calls you in and they start asking you questions, like, "How have you done this?" and "When did you do this?" and you don't really know what's going on, and, like, that would be a good example of, like, hot executive functioning. Would that
Because
work?
I would imagine that I just wouldn't be paying attention. No. No,
Well, you mentioned that this was an inhibitory control. The driving one was an example of inhibitory control. So I'm wondering if there's
mhm.
another type of like hot executive functioning that is related to the other controls. So what are the different elements of the hot executive functioning?
They go on to talk about how the three primary executive functions are working memory, set shifting, and inhibition. So those were the
Mhm.
ones that they focused on primarily.
Mhm.
We're starting to get into results a little bit here just because it's relevant, but the only executive function that was found conclusively and reliably to be impacted by this emotional stimuli was the inhibitory control.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you respond correctly, and can you
Yeah.
discriminately respond? Can you withhold your response
Yeah.
under emotional control? No. Answer for me, no.
Because that was the example. Because I was just taken back to when I was learning to drive and like being like the inhibitory control stress of driving while being given, sometimes supportive, sometimes less than supportive advice about.
So, I actually did find a study about driving training programs and, this
Wow.
topic. Yeah.
Wow.
Like driving interventions with around executive functioning, but we're not going to talk about it today because pretty much all of the research that I found was about how to improve your
Mhm.
executive functioning, your hot executive
Mhm.
functioning by way
Mhm.
of treatment, but the research suggests we're really not there yet, so I figured we'd not look at
Right.
them. We'll save it for another decade.
Yeah, another wait, yeah, in 20 years' time, we'll come back and we'll talk about that. So, if we're talking about working memory then, if we were to kind of give an example, like again, they didn't necessarily find one, but if we were to give an example of what it could be, hot executive functioning related to working memory, would it be something like, yeah, you're like maybe if we think of a more positive hot example, it would be like you're doing a pub quiz and someone's like, what's the capital of Russia? And you're like, oh, like something like that. You're trying to remember it. And your working memory is leaving. Although I guess working memory is not, that's like long term memory, which actually some research indicates we're quite good at. Working memory would be like if you left the house and you were like, okay, I have to go and like do the washing when I get back. And then when you were out, you got into a car accident, bringing back the driving. That would be an example, maybe.
I think it's really about the emotional conditions happening while you need to remember. So, yes. So,
Right.
basically, like, they do the digit span tests all the time. They make you,
Mhm.
like,
Mhm.
remember a certain set of numbers. So, imagine the
Mhm.
task is you have to memorize somebody's phone number, but also, I don't know, somebody's crying in the background. Or
Yeah, your kids. We
yeah.
literally had that happen as we jumped on the call today. So yeah, okay. So you're trying to like someone's like, write this down, and you're like, right, okay, trying to remember it, trying to write, put it down. And then at the same time you've got like kids are crying in the background. That would be a good example. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Then what about set shifting? So set shifting is sort of otherwise known as transition times.
That's the one that gets us every time. I feel like transitions are the most difficult when you're under emotional conditions.
Yeah. Yeah. Imagine, okay, so like imagine you had like a meeting at work and it was very stressful for some reason. Like maybe, somebody, you found out people are getting restructured. And then, I'm sorry for everyone who's now thinking about that. We have a system for you. We'll talk about that in a second. But, everyone's getting restructured. And so immediately after that, you have to do a presentation. Like the set shifting on that would be rough.
Mm-hmm. Or even you're at the doctor's office and you've just received shocking news, but now you have to listen to the instructions that they're about to give you.
That one, you're right. That's one of the reasons why I often recommend that people with ADHD bring someone with them if they can to like doctor's appointments, things like that. Like when it was, sorry, this is a tangent, but, when it was COVID and I was having my first child and my husband couldn't come to all of the sessions. And so you're like getting tests and like, they're like, and then this, and obviously you'd have to, because you're working through the medical system and it's always complicated. And yeah, always forgetting, always trying to reach for a notebook. The second time I had a baby, I was like a bit more prepared, but the first time was a real shock in terms of that. So definitely.
Yes. And honestly, sometimes doctors are good with you, like recording the instructions, or they'll write it down for you, or whatever the case may be.
Yeah. I should have just recorded. That's a good idea. Hey, you listening to this podcast. If you like what we do and you want to hear more of it, there is one way to make sure that happens. Please go ahead, subscribe, and leave a 5-star review. We have been told 5-star reviews can help us to get seen by more people, which means more people are going to learn about ADHD strategies.
Just press the button. Just give us a 5-star review.
We did want to reference, by the way, because this is kind of a conversation about emotional dysregulation and that kind of thing. We don't have the opportunity to talk about strategies to help with that as much in this podcast as we wanted. But if you just message us grounding, where do they message us, Sarah?
Aren't they messaging your email directly?
They are, yes. Email me, Sky@Unconventional Organization, with the word grounding. Or send me on Instagram, Unconventional Organization. And we'll send you an article that we wrote that we use a lot with people who are struggling with emotional regulation, obviously including the disclaimer that we are not therapists. Yeah. So we did just want to reference that at the beginning of this episode. Okay, cool. So do you feel like we've got a solid sense of hot executive functioning, what it is?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have a good idea that the hot executive functioning is like trying to access your logical brain while you're also experiencing that fiery emotion, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So the cold executive functioning is just everything else, everything that we normally think of as an executive functioning task. Trying to write that email, assuming that email doesn't have emotional implications.
I know. I was just thinking that when they said that. Now that we've really got into it and we've like built up these examples, I'm like, do I ever do cold executive? Isn't everything?
Great question.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Okay, so they really went into it in terms of how they did this. So do you want to take us through that?
I mean, first, I just want to talk about why it's important, because these authors talk a little bit about like the history of hot executive functioning. I mean, it's sort of a couple of decades in the making. There's a lot of research on it now, and the reason why that is because researchers consider this a possible explanation for the different mood presentations that happen in ADHD. The high rates of other psychiatric like co-occurrences. This emotional component that inhibits our executive functioning could be an explanation for that. Now, in order to do a meta-analysis of research, you have to sort of take the different studies and you have to look at what they were measuring and analyze the same. Yeah, but unfortunately, when they started to look into the research zeitgeist that exists, they didn't find consistency like you would hope. I mean, I think actually I'm trying to summarize their words, but really I should just share with you a direct quote. from the authors. Despite its promise, poor conceptual clarity and inconsistent measurement of hot executive functioning persists. Unfortunately, these limitations have made it difficult to draw many meaningful conclusions about hot executive functioning, even after 20 years of research.
Yeah. And you can kind of feel the frustration in that. Like they really
I hope I did
wanted
it
this.
justice.
Yeah. We'll have to ask them. But it's they really did, want this to be a thing. And I think when you so there's two things. One is when you use the examples that we used at the beginning of this episode, which is why I wanted to do it, you really want to talk about this because it becomes suddenly super important that emotions become a part of the conversation because you realize how much it affects your ability to do things. And then also, it has been used. Like, I think Russell Barkley added to his conversation later on in his research to bring in this emotional element. So if everyone could get on the same page about how they were describing it and how they were discussing it, we could make some real movement.
Yeah, I mean, some of these methodological concerns were like some of the studies had a rewards component, but in some of the studies, the reward was imaginary. And then in other studies, the reward was real. You can't even compare those two studies, even though you should be able to. It's just
imaginary chocolate versus real chocolate. I get it.
Yeah.
It would be different. It would be different from me if you were giving me.
So another issue I think that we should definitely mention is that most of the studies into hot executive functioning are done on children. I mean, very young children. Most of it is on preschoolers. Some of it is on adolescents. So like mid-school age. But I couldn't find anything that specifically said it was for adults.
Which is kind of crazy because like all the examples we just had, they were only adult examples. Like they were relevant to adults because, one of the reasons people come and work with us is because the older you get, sometimes the more executive functioning you have to do under pressure.
Ooh, so this is a really great shout out to one of their like future research should do this things. They specifically said that we need to account for age-related differences. So, for example, teens value social rewards, but children value like marshmallows, right? And connections.
Yeah, that is true. That is true.
And adults, what do adults value? I don't know.
Yeah.
It's something. I'm sure.
Do we know? Have they researched it? Yeah. I mean, what do I value? I still value marshmallows. It has to be said. A good marshmallow will get me. But
I recently had a hot chocolate flavored marshmallow from the farmer's market, and it was just a lovely treat. Highly suggest treating yourself.
I regularly have the New Zealand chocolate fish. My cafe, if you order a mocha, they give you a little, like it's got pink marshmallow in it, and then the outside is wrapped in chocolate shaped like a fish. It might be the reason I go to that cafe. I'm not going to say that it's not.
I've never been given chocolate freely at a cafe. We really need to step up our game here.
Yeah, it's great. It's amazing. So we've established that chocolate might be the answer. Maybe it goes back around and, all of it, but we don't know. That's the point. We don't know.
Yeah, in terms of like other things that they suggested, really they just said that more research is, and I quote, desperately needed on emotions' role in cognition. Desperately.
Yeah.
So if you're a researcher and you're in the position to look at emotions' role in cognition, do it, and we will be talking about it. And if 100%. You want help, we have a community of people.
Yeah, if you're looking for a gap in the research, we've found it. Here it is. It's on a platter. Share it with your friends. But I guess my question then is like, okay, do you want to go a little bit into like how they found the research? Because they did it they had a whole section on like, it's not a literature review and it's not a literature review. Like, how did they do this?
So they are very open about the fact that they used Google Scholar to get their articles. They didn't put any date ranges. And like I said, they couldn't really search for things like hot executive functioning, because that's not really a concept that exists, but they did look at things like decision making, choice impulsivity, delayed gratification, and then also the list of specific tasks that might be used, like the stop signal, the go, no go task. These are all executive functioning tests we've talked about in the past. They looked at some other search terms like working memory and inhibition, because those were concepts that were really important to them as being a part of hot executive functioning. So again, they really just tried to get all of the research that they possibly could that might be related and then see if it is. And it sounds like they didn't find as much in common amongst these studies as they would have hoped. Honestly, I couldn't even find a concrete number of studies that they analyzed.
Yeah, that might be a good question, actually, is like how many they found.
I looked and
Yeah. Oh, I believe you.
Find it.
The one thing I know about Sarah, she will hunt for the answer if she can find it.
I mean, it basically says that when they searched their terms between 2000 and 2010, they only got like 3,700 results. But when they looked at the next 10 years, so 2011 to 2021, they found 13,000 results. So that's like almost 4 times as much.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. So again, I'm sure in the next 10 years, there's going to be more research, but
is it consistent enough?
Yeah, these people suggest that we should really go back to defining the construct, validating the construct and its measurements. Enough of this, like, how does your favorite sport impact your hot executive functioning? Like, that's not what we need to be looking at right now.
Yeah, it's an important thing. And I think something that a lot of areas have is that, everyone kind of wants to get into their own, they want to add their own piece to the research. I definitely understand that. But if that piece is methodological in terms of like the definition and what you're doing, and then everybody does it, you do end up in a space where you can't easily do a meta-analysis, which is what I imagine they would have liked to have done here.
Yeah.
And there's a reason that when I'm learning about time blindness or working memory or anything like that, the first thing I'll do is look for a meta-analysis, because an individual finding is interesting, but I'm not going to change my way of life over it.
Yeah, absolutely. They talk about how there's actually no meta-analysis of this with youth.
So basically, no meta-analysis of the idea that emotions could be affecting how we executively function, which is kind of a big deal.
Yeah, it's wild because that is such a core belief of so much of CBT. And like mindfulness and even conscious discipline classes. I mean, the idea that you can't be acting from a survival state and also accessing your brilliant brain. It's everywhere.
Yeah.
But not ADHD research specifically. Kind of weird.
Yeah. It is very interesting and very strange. But it's nice to have a paper that really brings it out to the forefront, because we can sit here and be like, oh, what I'd like to see a paper on actually is a paper on the fact that when we talk about ADHD diagnosis in research, if we're diagnosing it with an actual psychiatrist versus a teacher looked at a bunch of people and said, I think that was the worst one we ever had, was a teacher looked at a bunch of people and just wrote if they looked ADHD, and that was how they decided if someone was ADHD in the study, not in real life. That is another example of that very wildly inconsistent systems making it hard to find answers. So yeah, consistency, but it's hard to do, but it's nice to have somebody asking for it.
It's so nice. I knew about this concept before, but because of the lack of research, I sort of left it in the back there. And so when this got brought back to the front by our research team, shout out to Taylor, Sky was like, I think we're going to, I still don't think I understand this. And I'm like, yeah, I totally get that, because it's all a bunch of like terms that don't really mean anything. Yeah.
But hopefully now you all understand it a little bit more. Hopefully we've illuminated it. If anybody asks about what it is, you can always send them this episode. And yeah, I guess what's the takeaway for people who are listening to this?
It would be best to interrupt the emotion before trying to access that logic, which is why we suggest the grounding. If you have any kind of mindfulness practices, any kind of personal check-ins or sensory, I don't know, pleasing things, do those, because when you're experiencing emotion, it becomes too hot, too spicy to access the logic part of your brain. And so when we give space, when we let the emotion dissipate a little bit, when we distract our brain even, and then offer it a new direction to go off in, we're going to be much more likely to do the executive function, task that we're asking of ourselves. Otherwise, we might just spin our wheels trying to write this email, and now we're crying because we can't write the email, and now we can't write the email because we're crying and we can't even see the computer.
Gosh.
So,
this is not triggering at all.
It's okay to just take a moment and
and break that cycle. Definitely. Yeah, and so if you want to email me just with grounding to Sky, you can do that, and I'll share with you the system that we have used with clients to kind of help break that, because it is tricky. And hopefully in the next 20 years of this podcast, we will be able to bring you some research that really dives into this as well. I think that would be amazing. Awesome. Well, I hope you guys had a great time listening, and we're going to keep chatting, keep bringing you the latest research into your brain, and hopefully uncover a little bit and give you something to share and also to chew on for your own experiences. Have a great day. Thank you for listening, everyone, and a big thank you to Adam for making us sound great and Anastasia for making us look great. We couldn't do it without you.
And if you're looking for any of the references to the papers that we discussed, head on over to our show notes page, because I always bring the receipts.
Plus, if you want to find out more about us or any more deep diving into what we're doing, you can find us on Substack. That's where the community is. That's where we're chatting, and you can see all of the fun and exciting things that we are bringing to the table.
Thanks for being here.